So I know there's a lot of different theories out there, but in my opinion, the best format for a debate is to take the two people, put them both inside, the bags that the mail carrier wears with all the letters in it.
Mm-hmm.
Put two people inside of that bag, and what's the only thing that they can say to each other? Let's not get carried away. That's You tell me what's better than that.
I can't think of anything.
Oh, hello there. Welcome,
Hi.
welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today, I have another special guest, and I know him best as my dad. His name is John. So thanks for joining me today.
Oh, glad to.
And so he's come all the way from Wisconsin to spend some time with us this weekend for his birthday. We don't have to tell him how old you are, but let's just say I have a few gray hairs and you have none. So, and now everyone knows, all those who have endured my sense of humor over the years. Now you have a face to put with the name to blame. So there you go. Let's see here. My dad is a preacher in Wisconsin. He's been there for 25 years or something.
27.
27 years at the congregation there. So I've been there for quite a while. And that might make this situation worse because now we have two preachers here. And normally we could make a joke about now this video sermon is going to be twice as long. But the joke's kind of on us instead because you're the one that knows the future. You know how long that will be here. And we're stuck in the middle of the present and we don't. So I guess you know. Wisconsin, of course, is the place that I call home. Although I don't know if I'll be returning there. It is still my home. And even when I can't go there, parts of my home can come to me here in Michigan. And if you've heard all that we've said in the introduction so far, you might have some good insight and wisdom into the text that we are studying here today, which is Psalm 90, the 90th Psalm. And we want to have a spiritual dialogue, spiritual discussion about the text here today. So, Dad, Psalm 90.
Yes.
Begins, let me just read the first couple of verses here. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, you can't get a better start to a psalm than that.
Absolutely not.
That's we're on the right road here. Unfortunately, this psalm is going to take a drastic turn here in a moment. But before we get to that big turn, what do we see in the first two verses here in Psalm 90?
Certainly that encouraging part is this moment in which we hear the spot that you have been our dwelling place in all generations.
Okay.
God is that home for us. Home isn't just a destination that we drive to or go to or are away from, but home is this place, a gift almost from God. This He is our home. So there's never a moment in which we are away from it, in which we have built it or created it. He himself, we reside, our residence, our place is with him.
Okay. Now, that would be a perfectly good psalm in and of itself, except that that idea is sort of being challenged by the experience of the community and the psalmist himself here. We're going to spend a little bit more time in that with that idea in a few minutes, but just a couple more things here. To look at the turn, as we keep calling it, I call it that because there's this language about turning here in verse 3, and the psalm begins to take on a different tone here. And I was wondering if we could take a look at the text here in the next few verses. Verse 3 and following, you turn man back into dust and say, return, or you could translate this word turn. Turn, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. You have swept them away like a flood, they fall asleep. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. Talk about the turn that this text is making here. What do you see happening now in these few verses?
Out of this idea of home, suddenly we're in this thought and idea of that this assumed home, which should be safe and secure and nothing goes wrong, we're always in that presence. There's this turn in which that same God at this moment calls out to human beings here and says, now I, as a result of these things that are happening, I turn you to dust, and you should now turn away from those kinds of things. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, this is the classic Hebrew word, shuv. We've talked about that before in our congregation here. The different meanings that can be involved there. But yeah, it's sort of this, in a way, it's sort of a command, and then from another angle, it's sort of a call. God has the power to command people to return to the state out of which they were created, to this state of dust. And you can take that angle there, but I think the nature of this psalm is more, and might be, if you had to choose, maybe it's a little bit of both, but I think it's more of a call to his people to turn. So it doesn't have to be a totally literal take on a return to anything, but sort of a metaphorical call, a call to return to God and turn away from, like you said, the ways that lead to our dustiness, I guess you could say. The ways of dust. There's the ways of the dust, and there's the way of the turning and the repentance and turning towards God. And I think that is what he's calling them to do at this point here. And maybe it's a orienting the heart towards the home that he's talking about, the dwelling place in verse 1. Now, before we get any further in the text, I do notice that there's a superscript here at the beginning of Psalm 90. And interestingly, this psalm mentions in the superscript the name of Moses, and he's given the title of the man of God. What connections do we see between Moses and his life and experiences and the themes, the words, the message of Psalm 90?
It seems very possible that what he's asking us to do here is to focus the psalm through the lens of Moses' experience, especially his experience right at the end of his life. He's standing at Pisgah, he's looking out across over to the promised land, and the man who has been the one who has interceded for the people of Israel now stands there as the one who is not going to enter. There's this realization of that kind of the whole life goal, the whole journeying and arriving at this point of headed into the promised land is not going to become a reality. It's not going to happen for Moses.
Yeah, so Moses, famously the man who sees and knows God face to face as a friend, the man who famously intercedes on behalf of the people, that God would relent in his judgment, his punishment on the people in the wilderness. and Moses, who famously doesn't enter into the promised land, like you say. I think all of that captures the spirit and the essence, the situation of this psalm, Psalm 90. That's exactly what is happening in the text here. If we can get a little bit deeper into the situation of the psalm itself and the psalmist, we can start anywhere really, but verse 13 really captures one of the major pleas of the psalm, the calling out to God. Verse 13, call to Yahweh, return, O Lord, or it's the same word, return or return. A call to God to turn, and then this question of how long. Now, this is a psalm that we can use the word, I think a good word to use is exile to describe it. Now, there's no indication of specifically what sort of situation the psalmist and the community of the psalmist are in. It may very well be a literal exile, of psalm written in the context of Babylonian exile. But it could just as well be, and other commentators point this out, this could be a situation where there's been a season of famine or failed crop or a season of epidemic. That this could almost be any situation where the thing that we thought we wanted, the thing that we thought we had been promised, seems to have been erased. And we're left in this place of disappointment, devastation, and wondering how long. That's the question of the psalm. How long are we going to be in this state? And there's no mincing of words in this text either, as they take that to God. I really like this idea in verse 13, using this same concept, the same word that we saw back in verse 3. We're talking about this word for turning or returning. God makes that call and that plea to the people. The people make that plea and that call right back to God. He's calling them to turn, and the people cry out to God, asking him to turn as well. So there's this dialogical nature to the psalm that I think is key to understanding the nature of prayer and psalms in general. And there is, because of the nature of this, which is founded on this covenantal relationship, we can bring up any issue that we're experiencing or needs to be said. We can bring up the fact, we can even use God's words and repeat them back to him, like we're doing in this psalm. There is this reciprocity, this dialogical nature of the psalm here, and the psalmist and his community feel perfectly comfortable saying those words back to God, because what they're experiencing as we read through the text, verse 7 and 8, clearly the situation is being interpreted as a result of some sort of divine activity on God's part. The state that we find ourselves in is a result of God's divine activity. Maybe interpreted as God's wrath or judgment. That would certainly fit into the exile paradigm. That's why many people fit it there quite easily. But again, it could be any situation. But that's almost not the point. The point is that in verses 9 and following, all of our days have declined in your fury. We have finished out our years in a sigh. As for the days of our life, 70 years, or if we find enough strength, 80 years, yet their pride is but labor and sorrow. For soon all of that is gone and floats away. Who understands the power of your anger and your fury, according to the fear that is due you? So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long will it be? And then another request in verse 13, be sorry, or relent, or repent, change your decision for your servant. Satisfy us in the morning with your loving kindness, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Verse 15, make us glad according to the days that you have afflicted us, and the years that we have seen evil or trouble. So it's very clear here that these people, whether literal or at least ostensibly, seemingly, experientially, have been experiencing, in their estimation, something beyond what is due them. So fine, if we're in exile according to something that we or the generation before us did against God or against the covenant, fine. But there's a request for God to step outside of his eternality and say, think about this from our perspective for a little bit. You get to be God and live for eternity, and a day is like 1,000 years to you. But think about us. We get 70 years, 80 years if we're lucky, and you're asking us to spend that entire time in this state of existence in a way that life is not meant or intended even by you to be lived. So there's this plea and this request. All we get is 70 or 80 years. We don't get to live, in eternality like you. Can't you see that, appreciate that, and give us whatever number of years we've lived in this state? Return to us that same amount of years of blessing. So it's a longing, a plea, a cry to experience the blessing that they've been promised, that they were meant to experience all along.
And we might consider it a pretty bold action to turn to God and say, listen, you turn in the middle of this. But yet the psalm really says to us that this is kind of God's expectation even of us. And that faithfulness to him is not that we cower and that we just decide the best thing for me to do is to resign myself to my circumstances, but rather to boldly go before God with those same kinds of requests and thoughts of God. There is something more. We expect something more, not because we're just these creatures who are finite, but because of who you are.
Yeah, and it's sort of built in by design, by God's design anyway, for us to have those longings and those pleas. It certainly can't surprise him, because that's really what our nature is. Like we were having a different conversation the other day about the nature of a child. And if you, whatever life, good or horrible or whatever a child experiences, whatever hardships, when they're really small, that's the only life they know, and they live it to the fullest, and they wouldn't know the difference anyway. But at some point in our maturing, there comes this discovery of something called potential, and decisions are made, and we see forks in the road different, and we have an acknowledgement of things that might have been. And this idea of a future or a possibility of a different future that has come and gone, that sort of thing, that's what happens just developmentally, but that's what happens relationally too. All of that stuff is made possible, though, not just developmentally, but sort of to apply it spiritually. And in this situation, those sorts of realizations and epiphanies about what might have been only are the direct results of things like hope, like promise, like covenant. So God builds in that capacity and that possibility into the situation. So it can't surprise him when people cry out to him like this and ask him to turn and relent at the same time.
Oh my, absolutely true. Well said.
So that takes us through sort of the bold claim of the text, and certainly something that we can appreciate as prayers and people in relationship with God. We wanted to move to I guess we could call the heart of the text here, and that is the primary request. And I don't know if it's an ironic one, but it's certainly one that you might think is hard to come by, given what we've discussed so far. And that's the request in verse 12, teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. I think it's impressive that there's even the presence of mind to ask for this in the middle of this sort of complaint to God. And certainly, one way we can read the text is really just the people requesting a date on the calendar to circle. Teach us how many more days that we have left to count so we can live according to that. Tell us how much longer we're going to be here. Give us the answer to the question in the next verse, verse 13, how long? And that certainly might be there. But I think there's definitely something deeper, more profound in this request here. What do you see in this quest and request for wisdom and how it fits into the psalm here?
At least it seems to me that there's this moment in which the wisdom that they are seeking is the ability to be able to trust in the God of heaven and earth, this God who at the beginning is the one who is their home, so that the circumstances that they see all around them are not the thing that really determine the direction of their heart and of their life, but that they are the things that spur them on to seek after God, to know his particular ways and calling, and that part of us, that voice inside of us that you mentioned before, that strives for and longs for something else. So kind of this wisdom of God, give us the ability to trust that you have made us who we are, and that your making of us, your design, is the right thing. May we trust in that and follow after that. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. You said a phrase there, something about the way that God created us to be. I think that might have some connections here to the very end of the psalm in verse 17 and following. There's this double request about the work of our hands and letting that be confirmed and established. That's connected to verse 16, request for God's work to be made manifest in the situation. Parallels with his majesty and his favor, but ultimately that is going to be expressed, or at least it's imagined, requested to be expressed through the work of our hands, which I think is interesting. How does that connect with what we were created to be in this theme of wisdom?
Yeah, as God's image, he has made us to be those who carry out his project and design here. And it would be easy for us in a moment in which life is falling apart to think that precisely that what we are molding and shaping with our hands crumbles with it. But there's this call here that rather than it crumbling and being crushed, that God, through his grace and mercy, his hesed, establishes it and builds it according to how he has made us to be.
So in the middle of a life or situation where things seem to be that somehow we might never find or realize what might have been. That's sort of the initial position of the psalmist here, that I'm in the middle of a situation that seems irreversible, and whatever I can imagine that might have been, this blessing, alleged blessing that we were supposed to experience, somehow that's gone horribly wrong and probably never to be found. But there seems to be, that might be the initial cry, but you're saying then that maybe something else is possible. Even if your initial response in the moment of prayer in whatever situation in life is to say, everything that I might have been or we might have been is lost, and it is simply a complaint and a lament to God. You're saying there might be something to be redeemed there, some sort of hope, some sort of piece of home, some sort of light there that can be found. And that's connected to finding or our ability to still discover that which God created us to do and to be, even in that place.
Oh, I think that's a very good summarization of it, yes.
Okay. Now that's easy to say.
Yeah.
Definitely hard to do.
Yes.
But it's honest. That's where the psalmist is at. And I think there's not a lot of resolution here, except for that little discovery, that little piece of recognition that there is, even in the most horrible situation where everything has gone wrong, and I don't understand what God's doing. I don't understand the future, except the fact that it's different than the one I ever was supposed to have. Yet there's this little recognition that I can still find wisdom in this place. There's still wisdom to be sought and discovered, and there's still the work of God to be found and to be done in and through me. And when I do that, that purpose, that meaning, that homeness, that sense of belonging can be made manifest in me and in us, even in this place.
Yes, I agree. And I think I liked one of the words that you used there too. We're always looking for this sense that everything is going to be resolved, that there aren't any loose ends, that there aren't any gray areas, that there aren't any questions left yet that haven't been answered. Everything is clear. I think that's one of the things the psalm is helping us to grasp here, is that being at home in God leaves us with questions. It leaves us with things unresolved, and living in that unresolved questions or circumstances, whatever they might be, is part of what it means to be living now. But like you say, that doesn't mean that purpose has left and is gone, but that purpose still remains for us to seek after with all of our heart.
Very good. Anything else that we've left unresolved in our project here? Anything you wanted to mention?
I can't think of anything. I'm kind of glad they didn't have to put us in a mailbag.
Yeah, that would have been not good.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we didn't get too carried away here, almost. But we can stop here. Thank you very much for joining me for this conversation. Good to have you.
Thanks, Justin.
You're welcome. Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.